We've recently launched our appeal to help the survivors of the devastating earthquake and tsunami that struck the Indonesian island of Sulawesi. As many of you will know, one of the really special things about the DEC is during an appeal, our 14 member charities come together to work together to raise money collectively and help those in need when devastating disaster strikes. Our members are organisations like the Red Cross, ActionAid, Islamic Relief, Christian Aid, and recently we welcomed our 14th member, Action Against Hunger. Today I'm joined by Action Against Hunger's Director of Operations, Juliet Parker. Juliet, now Action Against Hunger's name kind of tells us what you do, but tell us more about the organisation.
Sure. Well, we're delighted to be a member of the DEC and to be able to play our part in making sure that the support of the British public benefits people affected by crises like the Indonesian tsunami. The role of Action Against Hunger, really, we were set up 40 years ago. We work in 50 countries across the world, and our purpose is to fight hunger. So we are nutrition specialists, and in emergencies like this one, you would expect to see us focusing particularly on the nutritional needs of the population.
Yes, so we've seen the devastating situation in Sulawesi, but what exactly, we know people need food in the immediate instance because obviously their houses have been knocked down and things like that. But tell us about what sort of support in terms of food that people in situations like this would need.
So the first thing you would expect to see organisations like ours doing is to really assess and understand the needs of the population. And it's not surprising that in most emergencies like this one, food and water would be the primary needs. In terms of what we would be looking at, it would really depend on how the people have been affected. So you might find situations where people affected by disaster still have cooking pots and kitchen utensils and the ability to cook food for themselves. And they might also have access to markets where they can still buy fruit and vegetables. In which case our role is really to provide the bits that they're missing so that they're able to cook food for their families. But there'll be other situations, and there are people affected by the tsunami who definitely fit into this category, where they've lost everything, which means that they will have absolutely nothing for themselves, and we would then expect that organisations would be providing cooked meals in order to make sure that the children in particular have sufficient access to food.
And when you talk about food, paint a picture of us for what type of food that might be.
The important thing when you're looking at nutrition, particularly for children under 5 who are one of the most vulnerable categories, you would be having to look both at the quantity of food that they have access to as well as the variety of food. So you would be wanting to make sure that any child has access to a well-rounded, nutritious variety of food within their diet, because when children become malnourished children are 9 times more likely to be affected by other diseases than well-nourished children, which means that we don't want them to fall below that threshold where they become more vulnerable.
So an interesting thing I heard recently when I was visiting a different disaster zone was that, often we think people get sacks of rice as a common thing they would get, or lentils. Which is very much needed and is a basic source of carbohydrates. But one of the things I heard, I thought was very interesting, is that especially with young children, if you continue to just feed them rice day in and day out, if you don't have variety, they lose interest in their food and they stop eating. Is that correct?
Well, as I was saying earlier, the important thing isn't only to look at the quantity of food. You will also need to look at the quality of the food and the variety of the nutritional inputs from that food. And also it has to be culturally appropriate. So it has to be something that the family and the children in particular are willing to eat. Otherwise it won't benefit them.
Yes, a fascinating thing something I saw recently was that, families chose a lot of chilies and onions to give flavour to food for the reason that you said. But I discovered that the spinach wasn't as popular because nobody seems to like spinach, even children. But it was an interesting thing to see how different communities prioritise different food groups and different types of food. Again, culturally appropriate, that's very important, that the food has some flavour so that children eat it.
Yes, like another example is in many emergencies you'll see salt as part of a standard food package, and clearly salt has no particular nutritional value, but actually to make the food acceptable and palatable, it becomes one of the important things that we can support families with.
Yeah, no, I think it's really, really interesting because I sometimes think, you know, me included, you think, well, people should be just happy to have that rice and that's all you need. But it was a really fascinating insight, I thought, into the fact you can't force children to just keep eating rice, that they do need variation. Now, another thing you see in many disasters, such as countries like Yemen, are those really, really starving children. And I know that's what, you know, affects people when they see starving children on drips. Is that likely to happen in Sulawesi?
So the situation like Yemen, and there are others, of course, around the world at the moment, it's a much more complicated emergency with a long protracted crisis underpinning the entire situation. And so you wouldn't expect to see the same situation in Indonesia where the national and international communities are working much faster and much more effectively in order to prevent those sorts of situations that you see. So they're very different scenarios, but there are commonalities. For example, water. We always prioritise water and access to water within our emergency responses. And as a nutrition organisation, that's particularly important because if families don't have access to clean water, what you'll find is you'll have the spread of diarrheal diseases, for example. And the reason that that's important from a nutrition perspective is because as soon as kids become poorly with diarrhea, it means that they aren't absorbing and using the nutrients that are present within the food. And so you would expect to see a decline in the nutritional status of the population. And Yemen is a much more complicated situation than Indonesia at the moment. But what you can see there is the devastating effects of a water infrastructure that has been destroyed, which is leading to much higher rates of cholera than you would ever want to see.
And so sort of pulling back a bit, when we, you know, at the moment we haven't got to that dire situation in Sulawesi, but how do organisations like yours go about assessing the population and making sure that it doesn't slip into that sort of extreme malnutrition?
Sure. One of the important things, particularly when you're looking at health and nutrition and water, is that organisations like ours and the national ministries and the national organisations will continue to assess the situation with regards to health and water, because it can change very rapidly, and they are some of the first indicators of other more complex underlying problems. So you would expect to see that organisations like ours and the national organisations and the government structures would be coordinating on coordinated assessments and coordinated information sharing, so that as a whole community we can pick up and respond to the most important and prioritised needs.
And then on a practical level, how does someone assess that a child is malnourished?
Sure. So one of the tools that we use is a MUAC. This is a middle upper arm circumference band. And this is one of the tools that you'll see in a lot of nutrition programs across the world. And the way it works is that you put it around the child's arm and then you pull it through until you reach the width of the arm. And if it's in the red, then the child is malnourished and needs treatment. And one of the reasons it's so successful as a tool is because it's so cheap and easy to use. So you'll even see mothers using this in order to support their children.
Well, thank you, Juliet. That was really, really interesting. As we've been discussing today, there is need for food in the situation in Sulawesi, but hopefully it won't get into that really, really dire phase where you see starving children on drips. But we do need your help to make sure that the people of Sulawesi get as much food as they need so things don't slip into a terrible state. So please do continue to donate generously at DEC.org.uk, and £50 will help a family with the food they need for a month. Thank you.